I'm Brian Kahn. The word citizen is not very often used in our culture, but it was by the founders of our nation. They bet all they had on the premise that regular people would live up to the responsibilities of citizenship, personal responsibility and integrity, engagement in our radical democratic experiment, full participation in the community, and if need be, defense of the country. When the history of 20th century Montana is written, it will include a short list of outstanding citizens, people who through their personal efforts made an exceptional contribution to this state. One of these will be Joe Sample of Billings. Despite long involvement with radio and television, Joe is not much given to talking in front of a camera. But after some arm twisting, he did. Here is some of what he said.
Welcome to the Greater Montana Foundation Legacy Project, preserving the history of Montana broadcasting and the pioneers of communication whose vision and foresight brought together the people of Montana.
Well, I was born in Chicago, Illinois on the, well, it now would be kind of considered the South Side, the old Presbyterian Hospital on March 15, 1923. And when I was about 3 weeks old, we moved to a suburb on the North Shore, Lake Forest, and I grew up there and went east to both prep school and Yale. And I was halfway through my junior year at Yale when I had volunteered for the ROTC and I was called up for active duty.
What was their ethnic background?
Ethnically, my father was a Scotch Presbyterian who could quote the Bible at great length. And once he got out of the control of his mother, I don't think he ever went to church again. And my grandfather on my mother's side was Irish Catholic, but they had an agreement. He married an English lady, and they had an agreement that any child brought up would not be brought up as a Catholic. So my mother was a Presbyterian, and she was Irish.
Was your dad from a farming family?
Well, my father was from a little town of 513 people in southeast Missouri, and he had decided quite early on that he was not going to amount to much if he stayed there. So he went into World War I, and when he came out, he went into the advertising business. Actually, he sold space for the Saturday Evening Post. And about the year I was born, he started an advertising agency in Chicago with a couple of other people. And my mother came from a fairly well-to-do family in Minneapolis. They were in the lumber business.
When you say he understood human nature, how would you describe that?
My father had a great understanding of human nature, which made him successful in advertising. And I think that was important. My parents were great. I could never understand how people didn't like their parents. I just thought mine were terrific. He came obviously from the country, and it never totally left him, even though he really was in Chicago or Florida for by far the majority of his life. But the people he knew in Missouri and the type of people they were and that sort of thing stayed with him forever. And he had a great sense of, sounds kind of stupid to say, but the common man. He didn't always use it to the greatest effect, in that one of the things he did was he was practically father of the soap opera, because he had seen what happened to syndicated stories in the Saturday Evening Post and that sort of thing. So he transferred that to radio, and they became the #1 broadcast agency for a number of years. But it was an interesting business. He had one of the first soap operas was Betty and Bob, and Nancy Reagan's mother had 2 parts in that show.
When you say they had positive values, what does that mean to you?
I think one of the things I learned was the importance of being, of integrity. And oddly enough, the person I learned that from was Arthur Murray, the dance guy.
Okay.
We, at one point, because we had a client who had virtually no money to spend, bought the Arthur Murray show because it was cheap. And Arthur Murray, his wife got starstruck and started to take on guest stars who were fairly important. In fact, one time we had Groucho Marx, who was a classic. The outfit I worked for was dancer Fitzgerald Sample. And at one point they were short. They used to do the rehearsals in Arthur Murray's studios, so they were short of people to dance. So Catherine Murray said, "Joe, you get up on the stage and fill in here." So Groucho watched this for a while and he said, "You must be Fitzgerald or Sample, because dancer you are not." Murray was very, very strict, and he had this integrity, because what happened was, when we came to renew, Murray said, "Well, I've got to have a little talent fee because we're running these guest stars in, and it's getting too expensive." So I negotiated a deal with him, and I came back to the client, which was an outfit by the name of Consolidated Royal Chemical, which was, we had a product called Liquinet that was one of the early hairsprays, and we had the Arthur Murray show on for 11 weeks and we didn't move one can of this stuff. And we found out the reason was it was like glue, and women were walking around with hair full of glue. And finally the new product came out, and the last 3 weeks of this show was gangbusters. So they were interested in renewing. But their sales manager was a guy by the name of Leonard Lavin. And Leonard Lavin is now, believe it or not, the head, and has been the head of Alberto Culver for a number of years, which is a large, large cosmetic firm. But he had started out as the sales manager for this crummy company that we were dealing with. And I exposed them to the fact that they now would have to pay this talent fee, which was really nominal. And Lavin was one of those people, you know, I'll make a big point with my superiors, you know. So he said, "That's absurd." He said, "I will call Mr. Murray and I will get him to either waive that or reduce it." You know, and my boss was sitting there, and I was all of 27 years old or something, and I thought, oh my Lord, if Murray yields one iota, you know, we're going to lose this account and I'm going to be dead meat. So I watched Lavin call Murray, and you know, he got through the usual palaver about Mr. Murray and all this stuff, and started talking about the talent fee, and his face turned white, and he hung up the phone. And he said, "Well, you know, I've come to think about it. That's not a bad charge." So I went back to the office and I called Murray and I said, "Arthur, what in God's name did you tell that guy?" And he said, I told him that we had made a deal, and it was a fair deal. We both agreed it was a fair deal. And if he wasn't off the phone in 15 seconds, we were going to pull the show. And that was it. So I said, "God bless you," you know. And we were friends for years after that, even after I left the business, because he had that integrity. And that was very important, because you could get people in advertising, somehow they felt it was perfectly okay to cut corners, you know, and do things. I assume there were probably kickbacks at times, none that I knew of, and certainly not for our group, because we were too small to merit a kickback. But it was unusual to find that. I mean, and this guy was something.
Why would you have decided to start up and own and invest in a hockey team like that in Billings, Montana?
The team had been here for 1 year. They'd moved it down. I mean, those teams never make money. They'd moved this one down from Calgary, and a fellow owned it here, and they had gone into the playoffs, and they developed an audience of a sort in Billings. And I had played hockey in college, very badly, I might add, and I liked the sport the way I thought it should be played. And the fellow that owned it was in effect going to go broke. So the manager and the coach came to me and said, you know, I had been at the games regularly, and they came to me and said, you know, how about taking this over? So I said, sure, fine, thinking this was going to be very easy because we had the means of promoting it and everything else. But we were a little early, to be honest with you. And we could only draw about 1,500 fans, and we needed really pretty close to 2,000 to break even. But we had wonderful players. I mean, several of them went on to really be very, very first-rate. We had the first draft once by the Boston Bruins, first amateur draft, and a goaltender for Edmonton and Boston. And it was a lot of fun to watch the Stanley Cup and see about 3 or 4 of your players in it. So it was a great deal of fun, but it also was a real beating. And the other thing that happened, which bothered me more than anything else, was they started to serve beer in the arena. And when that happened, somehow or other we got a different element in the crowd. It started out with families coming to the games, and it ended up with rednecks coming. And the game got rougher and rougher and rougher, and we lost our good coach, and we had to deal with lesser people. And the games developed into what hockey is today, just stupid fist fighting, you know. I've always said that any second-rate middleweight fighter could beat the best hockey player in the world in a boxing match, but you know, nobody listens to me, so I never quite made it. But it was an interesting experience, and as I say, a real lesson. Even well before Pearl Harbor, I had decided that we were going to have a problem, and I joined the ROTC as a result. So I decided that, number one, if I was going to be in the Army, which I really didn't look forward to that much. I'm a terrible soldier, absolutely the worst. But, you know, this way I could theoretically be an officer, and I could be there with a bunch of friends. And I do. I have friends who were in the ROTC that I still deal with. I was commissioned in June, I think, of '44.
As an artillery officer?
As an artillery officer.
How did you get into intelligence?
The orderly came down from the office and said, there's a guy here, major here that wants to talk to you. So I went up there, and there was this major, and he said, we're interviewing people, and would you be interested in taking on a hazardous mission? And always the smart ass, I said, will it get me out of Texas? And the guy said, I can assure you of that. So I wound up in the OSS.
Office of Strategic Services?
Yes. I had no idea what the OSS was. I'd never heard of it. But I went to Washington and I signed in, and then they put you out in a holding area that was down by Mount Vernon.
What was your job in China?
I was really trained to be an intelligence officer with Chinese troops. And I only did that for a couple of days because the VJ came along. So I never really had any problem, except during the Civil War. The communists didn't regard us too highly.
General Joe Stilwell. Remind us who he was.
He'd been in China for years before the war. And he came back to take over training the Chinese forces, principally in Burma and India, and also became Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff. But they didn't get along, and Chennault, the 14th Air Force Commander, General Chennault, who was up from the Flying Tigers, and he had disagreements about whether we had very limited supplies, and did they go to the Air Force or did they go to the ground forces, that sort of thing, so that eventually it became an untenable situation, and they replaced Stilwell. But I was on my way home from China, and I was at Hickam Field in Hawaii, and I was sitting reading a newspaper, and I looked over and I saw a star. And then I looked up and saw another star, and then a third star. And I looked up at the guy who was there, and it was Stilwell, and he was laughing. And I said, well, I don't often see lieutenant generals hanging around, you know. And we had a long talk, you know, about, because he hadn't been there for a while. He said, well, I see, you know, he saw the patch on my shoulder and he said, I see you're China-Burma India Theater. How are things going over there? And I said, General, they're pretty well screwed up. And he said, I could count on that, you know. We had a long talk, and just an awfully nice guy. He was on his way to Eniwetok where they were having an atomic test. But I had a great deal of respect for Stilwell. He was a real soldier. But then I went back and finished up at Yale.
You graduated when?
47, finally. And my roommate married a girl from Missoula. And I came out to be in the wedding, and that was my introduction to Montana.
So the Korean War had started. Were you still with the OSS?
August of 1950. I had stayed in the intelligence reserve because they gave you a choice when you got out. Either you could be in your branch that you were in, which in my case was artillery, which I wasn't that fond of. And I decided, well, if anything ever happens, you know, I want to be in intelligence. So I took intelligence reserve, and they ran a computer, and I dropped right out, and there I was. And I'm probably one of the, because there are only about 2 of them, one of the world experts on Taiwan. So they need me for that. I never got out of the south side of Chicago. Never moved, which was all right because at least I was a native Chicagoan and I had some understanding of the area, you know, and I think my title was Chief of Domestic Intelligence. And I think the valuable thing I learned from this experience was that you've got to be very careful of people's reputations. You cannot, and we were.
You started a show, Spreading Rhythm Around. How did that come about?
Well, it came about because our mutual friend, Mr. Granger, the esteemed manager of the station, I think had lost his announcer who did a show somewhat similar to it. Jack Nickel was his name. And he kind of liked the idea of having such a show, so he glommed onto me one day and convinced me that we should do this. And I think it's been going on for something like 12 years now. We have 100 shows or more in the can, so that we repeat them occasionally. Well, more than occasionally, probably. Well, I enjoyed it because you know, it's easy to do something you like really well. And gee, when you can sit there, and I've always made a huge collection of recordings and things like that. So when I could go back into my files and get the things that I really enjoyed and play them on the air and make inane comments, in addition, why, that's heaven.
Let's talk about your broadcasting, radio, and television background in Montana. How did you get in the business?
I had been looking after I emerged from the Korean War, was kind of a breaking point in my career in advertising, and we had been spending our vacations out in Montana, and I'd always liked it out here, so I decided that you know, we ought to try and find something that I could make a living at out here. A lot of people think that I came to Montana because there was a broadcast station available, and I wanted to be a broadcaster. What I really wanted to be was a Montanan. I came out here in 1952 to look at a station in Great Falls, Montana, a radio station. And the brokers said, well, you have to go to Butte. And I said, hey, wait a minute, the station's in Great Falls. I want to see the station. And he said, you don't understand. There's a fellow here by the name of Ed Craney, and he runs a network of stations. His headquarters is in Butte. And if you want to talk about this station, you have to talk to Mr. Craney. So I came out to see Craney. I found out later that he hated the broker. That was start number one. Number two, he'd been up all night because he'd been doing an election and his candidate had lost. So he was not in a great mood. But we sat down, and I suppose we sat down about 10 o'clock in the morning, and his wife brought over lunch, and we were there at 4 in the afternoon. And I finally said, look, Mr. Craney, I came here. He was a fascinating guy. He was very curious about everything. He wanted to know, how we did this in the advertising business. How we looked at this, how we measured audiences, how we did all these things. And I was answering questions as best as I could. And finally, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I said, "Look, Mr. Crane, I came here to look at this station in Great Falls." And his comment was, "Look, kid, you don't want that station. It's no good." He said, "You come up to my place at St. Ignatius, my ranch, and we'll talk about Montana, and we'll talk about broadcasting and that sort of thing." I said, "Well, we just met at 10 o'clock this morning. I can't come up and spend time at your ranch, Well, he said, "You come on up. Here's the key." He gave me the key, and I drove up there, and he appeared about an hour or two later, and I said, "Well, I can only stay one night." I think I was there for 4 or 5 days. Well, I think Ed, first of all, was a pioneer, and secondly, he was he really put together one of the first regional networks of stations that had ever been developed. He had stations in Bozeman, Butte, Helena, Great Falls, and Missoula, and then we got together, and when I bought the Billings station, then we added Billings into the mix and had an eastern thing of that sort. But Ed was really the pioneer in that area. He was also the pioneer in going up on mountaintops. He used mountaintops like antennas, and they weren't the easiest places to get to, needless to say, but that was Ed. He was an engineer, and his station in Spokane was on a mountaintop, and it went everywhere. It went into Montana and all over Washington. Unfortunately, it didn't go into Spokane very well because he was way up there, and you almost had to shoot down a tunnel almost to get to Spokane. So he had trouble getting into Spokane, but he pioneered that, and the station in Butte was very good that way, because we could get into Bozeman and Missoula and Helena and a great deal, many places that you shouldn't be able to get to. It so happened that I had looked at a radio station in Rapid City, South Dakota, and it was a good property, and I looked around, but I really decided I wanted to be in Montana, and I had a long talk with the owner of the station and why I wasn't interested in it and all that sort of thing. And I came out to Montana, and I was I did some freelance marketing work for a friend of mine in Butte who had radio stations, but I was essentially unemployed. My wife applied for a credit card at the local department store and said that I was unemployed. I said, "Don't say that. I'm self-employed," But they gave it to her anyway. But I was sitting one day, I was preparing to go on a train ride out to Vancouver, British Columbia, and I got a call from this fellow in Rapid City, and he was up in Butte with a guy by the name of Charlie Christ, who was one of the owners of the only television station in town. And he said, "Do you still want to be involved with a television station in Montana?" I said, "Sure." And he said, "Well, I've got a guy here who wants to get out." He was 30% owner of the station. And I talked to this fellow. I didn't have much time. I talked to him for about 10, 12 minutes and said, "I've got to catch a train, so if it's all right with you, when you get back to Billings, I'll come in and talk to you again." And his voice was slurred. And I thought, boy, that's a little weird. It's 9:30 in the morning, and I had a friend who'd been in the legislature with this guy. And I said, "Is it possible this guy could be stoned at 9:30 in the morning?" My friend said, "You bet." It's not only possible, it's quite probable. So anyway, I came back from Vancouver, and I stopped in to see him, and he was perfectly sober. But he had no recollection of our conversation at all, so we had to start all over again. And he said, "Well, you're interested in television. Do you want to be an announcer?" And I said, "With my voice? No way." He said, well, you want to be a salesman? I said, I can't sell anything. He said, well, what do you want to be? I said, I want to be the president. He said, that's my job. And I said, I know, but you're going to get competition, which they were. And I said, you people are really not television people. You're business people, and you want to take your money and go out and do something new with it. And the guy agreed with that. So we set up a deal, but next time I came in, he was stoned again, so I couldn't get anything. I couldn't get anything signed. I didn't want to sign anything while he was in that condition. It took me about 4 shots to get him where there were 2 times in a row where he was sober, and we signed a deal, and I bought the 30%. And as I always say, I ran the station so badly that the other 70% of the people wanted to get out, and we did that, and I think I had the longest non-performing loan that the First Bank, or Midland National Bank, it was called then, ever had. But we eventually, and then I went from there, and my friend in Butte wanted to sell out. He was quite a bit older than I was. And that was also lucky, because at the time, you didn't have to distribute the money that you made, and he had just piled it up in the company. But he could take it out at a capital gains rate, which was obviously better than income, so that I was able to buy the station, take his money, and pay him back. And the station paid out very well. I think, and I saw this even in China, you get out from the cities where there's a lot of corruption and greed and that sort of thing, and you get out in the countryside and talk to the average Chinese peasant and somebody like that. Now there's a man with a lot of dignity, who has who really has good values in lots of ways, and is really a fine guy. I thought they were marvelous people, really. And I think that's true in the United States, too. When I used to first come to Montana, the scenery obviously is beautiful, but the thing that really impressed me were the people. You'd stop and ask for directions, they'd give them to you. They'd get their shirt off their back, practically. And I hope that's still true. I don't know. I don't get around the way I used to, but And I heard an awful lot of other people, say the same thing. The people of this state are just fabulous, and I do have faith. I think they can be misled. I think they can do some bad things, but when a perspective is gained and there's enough time, I think they come around and correct those things and do the right thing.
This programming series is brought to you by the Greater Montana Foundation, benefiting the people of Montana through communication of issues, trends, and values of importance for present and future generations of Montanans. And by the Montana Historical Society, Big Sky, Big Land, Big History. And with the help of Cordillera Communications, with stations in Billings, Bozeman, Butte, Great Falls, Missoula, Kalispell, and Helena. Cordillera Communications, the Montana Television Network.